Today's clip is brought to you by warhammertournaments.com and their Coventry GT, a 400 plus players tournament where you can battle it out with hundreds of like-minded players and gamers for your chance to win a heap of prizes. The Coventry GT is held this November from the 5th to the 7th and is the UK's first ever 3-day 40k GT, as well as having a 2-dayer for anyone who cannot get the Friday off work. The link in the description to grab your tickets today, as well as using the code Hellstorm in all caps to get 10% off your order. That's again, others are linked down in the description to grab your tickets, as well as using code Hellstorm all caps to get 10% off. It really helps out the channel, and it'd be really cool of you if you could look it up. Thank you very much to warhammertournaments.com for sponsoring this clip. Really appreciate it. But I want to talk about terrain because that's something that's probably going to stay quite constant. And there's a lot of tournaments starting to happen now. There's illegal tournaments happening around the UK. There's tournaments happening in the US. Games Workshop have announced that they're releasing like a tournament roadshow with Mr. Mike Brandt at the reins, where they're running three events.
I'd be interested in. I have never been to an official GW tournament. For a lot of reasons, mostly because, and seeing as we're about to talk about this, I'll raise it as a point. Their terrain is absolutely terrible, as in there's just none of it.
Yeah.
Now, I appreciate that it's changed. I know one of the guys that's in charge of doing events over at Warhammer World. He's a really solid dude, and he understands the issues that have sort of been there for a while.
Yeah.
But Mike is someone that is known for not just putting terrain on the table.
Thank you, Solar Star.
Packing a table with terrain. So if he's in charge, that kind of makes me a little bit more interested to go to a GW like tournament roadshow, whatever they're gonna brand it as.
Yeah, for sure. So for this is 3 events that are running across the US, one in Orlando, 2 other places, very basically spread out the US. So so this has been posted in the ITC tournament organizers group, which I'm a part of because I am. Funny you should ask. I am an ITC tournament organizer. So Mike Brandt used to run Nova. So he's spearheading this project. That's his job. The global events manager or events coordinator, starting with the US, his hometown, his home country. I imagine since he's the global events manager, it will either mean Games Workshop are moving to take over and help out with everyone's tournaments all over, or we're going to see more of these roadshows across the world. Which is probably my guess.
I think it's likely to be the latter. The reason being is, and this is not me throwing shade at Games Workshop, they don't tend to work too well with others because they kind of like to have their own thing.
They like to do their own thing, yeah,
and
for sure.
If I ran the company that made the game that everyone was playing, I'd want to do that too, because then, of course, it's all my revenue and so on. That's just good business sense. But yeah, I can see there being quite a lot of these, if this works out to be a successful thing, run by GW, which is a good thing for the hobby. I mean, I can't see it meaning that something like the LVO is suddenly not going to happen anymore because everyone's playing at a GW event. But I can see it being an extra event to go alongside those big events that you get out there in the States as well.
So that's happening in the US. I know it's called the US Open Series 2021. But something has arisen because of what you've said. Obviously, Warhammer World being the only events that Games Workshop have run in the past 10 years, probably. Maybe less, I don't know. The terrain hasn't been very good. So and the problem is with Games Workshop terrain is that it isn't very functional, as is out of the box. There's a lot of windows. It's very expensive.
Yeah.
It's all plastic, so it's hard to build. But this roadshow is a Games Workshop event. So the chances of, we can pretty much confirm that the terrain is all going to be Games Workshop.
And why wouldn't it be? It's a great way to advertise your terrain, right?
Yeah, and they get it cheap.
Some would argue that they kind of make that in-house.
The thing is, with that, is that Games Workshop are going to be running like a tournament series. Supposedly the tournament's all ready to go. But I wonder what type of tournament terrain setup they're going to use. Because it's a bit of a meta now. I did tweet about it this morning, if anyone saw. Follow me on Twitter. I did tweet about it this morning that the standardized terrain layouts, or by what I mean by that is one terrain set across the event, moving depending what type of mission you're playing. So you'd actually rearrange the terrain before playing the game. Standardized terrain set is kind of like the new meta. It's kind of like what everyone's kind of going for. A lot of the big events.
People are starting to do it a lot more.
Yeah.
And do you know who pioneered that? Mike Brandt.
Oh, was it?
because the LGT terrain setup was based on the terrain setup for the Nova Open, which obviously was Mike's event.
Yeah, true.
There was
The Nova L,
fact,
the Nova L, especially
the Nova Ls, and that was I think that's what you're getting onto is that you ended up with this meta based around I'm going to this event, I know exactly what the terrain's going to look like, so now I know what I need to change my army for.
Exactly. So that's kind of like what the go-to is now, is that like a large tournament you can kind of expect, because most of the time, what like to you kids, chill, everyone sit down, a little bit of a financial chat for you. When you're buying terrain, it's expensive. If you go to a manufacturer and say, I want 100 sets of that terrain, it suddenly becomes a lot cheaper per unit. So, like, it's a financial benefit to buy all of the same terrain, which is kind of going to be kind of funny when we go on to what I'm going to be talking about. But also, it means when you go to a table, you aren't going to get jibbed or you're not going to get screwed over by the terrain layout, because you've got every table is the same, and it rearranges depending on what machine you're playing. So if you're playing Dawn of War, you move the terrain. You're playing Hammer and Anvil, you move the terrain again. But the problem is that when you're using all the same terrain, like let's say a tournament, like we've seen the LGT, we've seen the top 100 tables at LGT, seen loads of tournaments like Game Mat as well, their tournament all uses the same terrain on every board, right? And WTC are doing this, but they're a bit different because that's a team event. They've got actually like 8 setups, which is quite interesting. Yeah,
that's right. You have 3 different like densities of terrain on their table, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I've not really mentioned them for one thing. But the problem is when you go to a tournament, let's say any tournament that's going to be happening in the future, which is going to be using standard terrain, it doesn't matter what table you're on. The table number doesn't matter, except for placing, because you're playing on the same table. You're playing on the same table of terrain. You might have a different mat. The terrain might be sprayed a different color, but you're playing on the same board. Essentially, what you could do is basically be like, okay, everyone who's on the left side of the board, stay still, and all the opponents can run over to you, because it doesn't matter where you're playing, you're all on the same board. You know?
Yeah, you definitely could.
Yeah, which is a lot of complaints I've heard about standardized terrain, because the pros is that it doesn't matter what board you're on, it's going to be a fair game, because usually the terrain's symmetrical, or everyone's in that same situation, so you're not getting screwed over because you've only got a rock in your deployment zone and they've got a fortress.
Yeah,
which is the biggest the biggest issue when running the tournament is like getting
symmetrical deployment is the thing that you see a lot of in these situations, and for me that's great. I can understand for a lot of people why they don't like it. Maybe players that are, I'm not saying less competitive, like you're a bad player or anything, but I mean I look at everything from a perspective of I'm going to a tournament rather than I'm looking at everything from a perspective of I'm going to play a game of 40k.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm okay with that. But I get why some people are less okay with it.
Yeah, so you could say it's super functional. It makes it fair for each player. The sides doesn't matter because you've both got the same side, because it's a fairly symmetrical board. You know, you've both got the same terrain in each half. It's both the same distance, but it could be considered quite boring. Now, what do we do about that? Well, what can you do? Is there any suggestion or?
So there's loads of things that you can do about it. And I know you haven't really talked about the WTC, and
no,
I've got a weird view of the WTC, which is that it isn't a normal tournament.
Yeah, it is a team tournament, so the way they function is a little bit different.
It's not even just that for me. Like, let's say your event is a good place, right? So into the Hellstorm, we've got the Bolter and Chainsword coming up in August, so stay tuned for that. And you have a mix of players going to that event. Yes. Everyone from I play at the weekends with my brother because I love the game, to I go all around the world playing tournaments because I really love winning the game.
Correct, yeah.
Whereas at the WTC, you don't have that span of players. You've got these are just the best players in England to join.
These
the
people have been playing
and so on,
practicing for this event for the past 6 months on the same terrain.
So I kind of push WTC as an event type out to one side because it's a massive outlier. It's not normal. It's full of super hardcore players, and that's all they want to do is play that. And so I wouldn't even really consider that as a tournament when comparing it to other things.
That's fair.
But they have a way of doing it, which is we've got loads of different terrain layouts.
Yeah.
That use similar blocks
it's all
of
the
terrain.
Same assets. Really.
Yeah, that's the best way to describe it. But doesn't surely, Mikey, that's really difficult for anyone like myself or yourself to run an event like that, right?
Yes, it is difficult. However, I think because you want to, when you're running tournaments, is you're not just catering for the casual players and you're not just catering for the more competitive players. But why don't we mix it up? And that's why this morning I announced on Twitter for Hellstorm tournaments, which I am pioneering, so I expect everyone to be following in the next year. And I'll take my bags of money for everyone copying me. I am going to be using 3 different types of terrain, but all standardized, but all different. It sounds crazy. It sounds mad.
So from the perspective of me understanding, yes, but just for the sake of the conversation, no, please tell me more.
So I've kind of showed off 2 terrain layouts that I'm going to be using. The first one we have is the one on the thumbnail. This is a WTC setup. This is an example from a couple of months ago. It's just a picture I had on my phone. But this
table 1.
This is table 1, essentially, in the WTC terrain layout. In my opinion, table 1 is probably one of the best, most functional layouts, and I really like it. We play it on the channel all the time. I think it's really good.
Talked about it. I think it's solid.
Yeah. So I'm only running 48-man event this time because we've got a smaller venue this time around, but things are in motion, let's say that much. But for at least between, I think I'm going to try and aim for 8 tables will be at WTC, right? And this is for, I think it's Dawn of War, but depending what deployment you're playing, you'll rearrange this, To
be honest, I'm looking at the table, and Dawn of War, you have small fire lanes down the middle, and you've got some okay fire lanes at the sides.
Yeah.
But if you then played that Hammer and Anvil, exactly the same setup, fire lanes, nothing down the middle. If you play it corner to corner and so on, there's loads of different deployment maps you can play with that terrain setup. It'll be absolutely fine. It's been really, really cleverly thought out. There is as much thought gone into this as there is gone into designing maps for things like Call of Duty, League of Legends, all of those sorts of things, because it's just as important playing what we play as it is playing like multi-million-pound video games.
Yeah, exactly. Right? It is super important having the right terrain, So this layout, again, it was from the Las Vegas Open. It's for Overrun, which is mission 31. But it's also for a retrieval mission, which is mission 11. And it's also for mission 21, which I can't remember the name of. But this will be changing because there's a new Grand Tournament mission pack coming out. So there'll be all new terrain. The terrain layouts will be the same, but it'll be for different missions, So if it's Dawn of War, this will be the layout, for example. And Dawn of War, I mean, 10 inches on from the back, 24 inches apart of the long edges. Like this here.
Across the table rather than down the table.
Yeah, exactly. So that is going to be one type of table. Type 2 is our old faithful, GameMat.eu. Now, this is from 8th edition. This is from 2019. This isn't a finalized picture of the layout. This board is too big. But I'm actually adding this terrain to this terrain and designing these layouts myself, inspired by the other 2 layouts that I'm using. So these big squares are going to be trees. I'm going to have some trees stuck in there. These is going to be dense ground. So like dense industrial ruins. So they'll be like -1 to hit if you shoot over, but it's like a ruin otherwise. Not obscuring.
So would that be like the Mechanicus?
Yeah, exactly.
Start terrain then?
So if you're on it, you get like cover save, and then it's like -1 to shoot through it, but you can see through it. The
biggest question I've got to ask you about those little cake stands. Is can you stand a Riptide on top?
No.
That's good.
Yeah, because I'm basically going to give it it's going to be like a ruin without obscuring, but -1 to hit. That makes sense?
Nice. Yeah.
So if you shoot through it, you're -1.
I just want to touch on that quick if we can. This is something that I think a lot of people just sort of gloss over a little bit. Remember, you are fully in charge of choosing what keywords you assign to terrain. If it's written in the tournament pack, then you got to stick to that. But if you're making your own tournament, you can put a ruin down and not give it obscuring. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Up to you.
Yeah. So we're going to be using this layout, but it's going to actually have 2 large craters as well, which are 25 mil across, 250 mil across, so 25 centimeters across. 2 big fat round circles, which are WTC craters essentially. We're going to be adding those on as well, so it's going to be like a really like heavily populated board. Like compared to what it looks there, which looks really open. There's a fire lane straight down the middle, straight down there.
Yeah.
There'll be none of that.
There is.
Yeah.
I played on exactly this setup against a very good player with 3 repulsor executioners. with knights, and there's a lot of fire lanes on this table.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the biggest difference, I think, between an 8th and a 9th edition table.
We use so much more terrain.
Yeah.
So much more.
It's not just that, though, is it? That A, there's more terrain, but B, there's a lot more emphasis on thinking about where you're placing your terrain.
Yeah.
Now that we didn't have before, and that's just the evolution of the game, which is amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, this much terrain in 8th edition was fine, but this much terrain in 9th edition, even on the smaller boards and more compact, is not enough. You know, there isn't enough variation. You've got ruins. That's pretty much it. So, but this will be table type 2, and then we have a mystery type 3, which will be announced very soon. But some of you might recognize it. Let's just say that much. Covering 10 tables. That's what I think the best tournament layout is having lots of different standardized terrain.
Yeah.
Because it makes it more interesting. You can't go to my event.
Yeah, definitely.
You can't go to my event and write a list for the terrain. You can't think, okay, if on this mission, I can hide behind here and here and here. Obviously, you can if you want to, but you've got to plan for 3 different tables for every mission. Now, I don't know about you, but that's 18 tables you got to think about. There's a lot of tables to worry about. And you're only going to use 6 of them.
There's not that many different types of terrain. You've essentially got something that slows your movement down, something that provides minus 1 to hit, something that blocks line of sight,
correct,
and something that just gives you an armor save.
Yeah.
You can still kind of meta list a little bit.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
People should be encouraged to do that, because otherwise you're just setting yourself up for a loss at some point that you haven't really considered.
Yeah.
But the fact that you might know prior to the event, game 1 we're playing on this table, if everything is the same, at your event you'll have game 1 we're playing this mission. And that's it, right?
Yeah.
That makes it a lot
and you're going to be on one of 3 tables, but you don't know what table you're on at game 1, you know? You know when you get there. Now, I'm probably just going to alternate it, keep it easy. Be like, table 1 is WTT, table 2 is Game At, table 3 is Mystery, table 4 is WTC, etc. So the thing is that, like, we want to avoid, like, feeling samey at an event, which is my biggest, probably, like, concern with standardized layouts at tournaments, especially for streaming. You know, I'm coming at it from, like, a streaming angle as well as being a TO and a tournament player, is that when people tune in, and you turn on the stream, bang, there we go. Welcome to Hellstorm. We're streaming this event today. We're using this layout. That's cool. And then you tune in like 6 hours later, and it's the same terrain in the same position because you just so happen to be playing another deployment that's the same. That's boring, right?
Do you think people are becoming used to that though? Because for me, I come to GW for tournament play out of esports. So I played Games Workshop games pretty much my entire life, but I've had a few breaks in between. In one of those breaks, I discovered esports. I played StarCraft 2. I played League of Legends 2. And so for me, going to an event and seeing the same game, because it is the same game, regardless of what armies, there's not a lot of real difference when you boil it right down. Played on the same table. Doesn't make as much of a difference to me. And with the popularity of esports, do you think that people are becoming slightly more used to that? Or do you think that because there's still a kind of like historical group of people within the hobby, because the hobby sticks with you for life a lot of the time.
Oh, yeah.
That there's enough people that are like, no, we just don't want this. This is not how we play. And there's like the old guard, perhaps, having that mentality. Well, what do you think, just as a random aside?
So I think the idea of like Warhammer being a sport is still very much in its infancy, and I don't think people really know what or how it's going to develop. I don't think that people are coming to expect they want the same tournament terrain on every table. I think people want to expect that they're going to get good terrain on every table, you know?
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make. There's a difference between good terrain in like the way it looks, the way it functions, and I think everyone definitely wants one of those two, but they don't always want the same one of those two. Yeah,
because if you think about it, I don't know what percentage it is, but I think I read somewhere that like only like 20% of the people who play Warhammer have attended an event. I am led to believe, let's say, that the amount of people who actually go to a tournament is very low. And then the people who go to shops to play, their hobby store, their gaming center, or, you know, whatever, is also relatively low. Because most Warhammer games are played at home on the dining table.
Yeah, dining room table.
But I think people should come to expect like good terrain at a tournament. And I think that, as I said, the reason I'm doing this is because terrain should be fair on either side. You shouldn't ever turn up to a game and one person have a whole load of terrain and you have none. Because that's not going to be a fun experience. As if in the lore, you know, in Warhammer, you're never going to have a fair battle. That's just not how war works. But we're emulating war in a game, a tabletop game, which is supposed to be enjoyed by both people at the table, you know? So having good terrain on both sides of the board, all over the event is very important. Maybe should standardized terrain be a thing? Yeah, maybe. It should be. Does it create like a bit of a yawn fest for people who play more casual? They're used to playing with like a building from 20 years ago that they made themselves and then some new trenches or whatever. Yeah, I mean, fair enough, you know. That's how games are supposed to be played, you know. That's probably like half the intention of Warhammer is to play at home with your mates, you know what I mean?
Big time.
The competitive thing is a large part of it, you know. And I think the competitive community is very influential on how Games Workshop develop the game. But I don't think it's the majority. I think it's just the loudest minority,
I think you're 100% right with that. 100% right with that. Because we know that that's clearly there, because if tabletop players were only tournament players, or were say 70% tournament players, so the overwhelming majority, then I guarantee you GW wouldn't have spent time, effort and resource writing things like Crusade packs.
Yeah, exactly. It should be a waste of time,
you know, because they know they wouldn't sell them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Personally, like my dog in the fight is, as long as I go to an event and the event has good functional terrain, that's my number one thing. If it's all the same, all right, it's fine. It's all the same, and it means that yes, you can tailor your army to that event, which we've seen happen historically. Like I said, Nova had that, and certainly the LGT had that, and there's a lot of other places that have had that. My own events tend to have standardized terrain because it's easy, and that for a smaller event manager, creator, you know, runner, whatever you want to call it, that's kind of one of my concerns, because I haven't had much experience of running larger events and growing that. But if people have, like your event, I'm really looking forward to seeing the different terrains, because I don't really want to play on standardized terrain. Yeah. But I'd rather play on standardized terrain than turn up and there's just some random stuff thrown all over the table. Yeah. And that's exactly the fact that you're taking away that worry of just like, no one's thought about this. So great, I'm on table 2 and table 2 is absolutely shite, but table 5 is great. That's the thing that's what you don't want. Worries me. Yeah, you want to avoid that as much as possible, because the point of running a tournament is so everyone has fun, right? Yeah, exactly. And who's gone to even a local to play, looked at the table and gone, oh god, this is terrible. My opponent set up the terrain and it's just garbage, but I don't want to offend him by saying it's garbage. No, that's a feels bad right at the start, isn't it? Yeah, but that's the thing. So like, I think gone are the days, especially in tournaments, with the way that like Warhammer has developed so fast in the past few years, that it's a much more devastating game in terms of like the output that armies can do. Yeah, know? Yeah, things die super quick. Yeah, like I played 7th edition, and like you used to play with like 3 buildings, right? And like you used to have like a hill, and that was your terrain. Cover gave you an invuln. Yeah, was that 7? Yeah, it was. It gave you a 4+ save against everything. Shrouding, you remember? So we didn't play with hardly any terrain, and then 8th edition called for like lots more line of sight blocking because the armies are getting so devastating. Yeah. And then 9th edition is called for line of sight blocking, but also lots of different types of terrain, so it makes it more interesting. You know, we've gone from next to no terrain to absolutely loads and being super varied. And now I agree that boards shouldn't be the same all the time. I agree that, but the problem is that you can't set up a random board and have it work for every deployment, and that's the biggest issue. Yeah, that's the biggest issue we've got right now. You can set up a board with all the coolest shit you've got, and it looks awesome, and it's super functional and plays well. But then as soon as you deploy a different way, it is gonna be naff, and that's the problem. Yeah. That's the real problem. I've had that experience at a tournament. I went to No Retreat.
Yeah.
And the terrain at the SN events, I don't know if you guys have seen their stuff on YouTube or SN Plus, or but you've been there yourself.
The terrain's insanely
Their terrain
cool.
is gorgeous.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work very well in 9th edition.
You can't set up a board for 6 games. Doesn't work. And Mike Brandt has said this, The guy who's doing all the events around the world for the guys who make the game, he said the same terrain layout won't work for every game, for every deployment.
Who, let's be fair, he's not just done that. He was one of the team that wrote the missions we all play in 40k.
Exactly, yeah. So if
anyone's gonna know...
Yeah, if he's saying that the same layout doesn't work, then you have to do something. And the problem is the only logical answer right now is standardized terrain with a layout for each mission. Because you can't write a pack with like, how many tournament pieces have we got? Right, this table, right, I'm going to write a pack layout for this table for this tournament. Right, okay, I've spent 3 days doing that. Right, we've got table 2 coming up.
Yeah, now do the rest.
That's why standardized terrain is a good thing, but I think we need to like watch out and getting boring. Personally, do not like that approach. Probably talking about standardized terrain. This is from DK Spain. I don't like lists being pre-planned for an already set terrain map. I agree. Yeah. It is like an issue. This is why I've got 3 to make it even more varied. Because you can't.
I think we both said that was like the right way to do it.
Yeah, exactly. The one where Bailey says, I think an esport is designed to be samey, but the hobby has the ethos of variation. I personally hate turning up to an event and the tables being all the same. I actually love the sporadic, unstandardized terrain. Makes me have to adapt. I fully agree. With that sentiment, The problem is when you've got like 40 tables and then no one's rearranging them between games. If you're going up to a table and rearranging the terrain yourself, that's great. I love that. That'll be really cool. The problem is people aren't very good at that. As we mentioned, as Jay mentioned, you got that mate, you turn up on a Tuesday night, you go and play a game, he's put loads of buildings in on one side, you've got loads of craters, and then you roll for sides, and he goes, I'm going to go for one with the buildings. That's great. That's not going to be a fun time for anyone.
And we've all been like completely done over in a game on one dice roll. Maybe it's like, I didn't make that charge, or I failed that save, or whatever.
But it shouldn't be the first
roll. It's the first roll.
Yeah, exactly. It shouldn't be the first roll. And that's the thing. So standardized terrain has its pros, but as I've mentioned, it has its cons, and that's why I'm doing the way I'll be doing things, having a mixture of terrain, 2 questions, one on Twitch and then one on YouTube, but YouTube's more of a statement. Green Link says, one thing you should never do is play a place terrain. Good boy, what if TOs will add extra time to the old fantasy rules where all the players set up the terrain? Again, the problem is like, it takes a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of like, the thing comes down to is the organization of the terrain and having all of that different type of terrain on every table, whereas standardized terrain is a lot easier to financially to buy, a lot easier to store because you just store it in our box and that's a table, and then it's set up and stuff like that. There's a lot of things that get involved where standardized makes sense, but also it isn't perfect. That's what I'm kind of saying. I'm saying
it's like the logistics, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's the best of the bad bunch. The problem is it's just logistics and just trying to sort all that out, which people haven't got time to do. They haven't got there's not unlimited money. And as I will keep saying, tournaments are too cheap. So if you want all these fancy things doing, you have to pay some more people, So there's like no real perfect solution, but I feel like standardized terrain, but a mixture is like the best of what we've got right now.
I like it, and I'm super excited to come to your event to play on it.